All right. Dr. Okubagzi, I see you're on, so I'm going to go ahead and go through some introductions and some housekeeping for our session. We will be recording this session, so we'll start on time, and I know that these recordings are getting looked at as they're posted on our website. So I'd like to welcome everyone to the second of our series this summer on Pathway to Decentralized Clinical Trials. This is session number 2. We're very pleased to welcome Dr. Okubagzi. So again, this is part of the Georgetown Howard University Center for Clinical and Translational Science, known as GUTS, which is a multi-institutional consortium of medical research institutions forged from a desire to promote clinical research and translational science. The members of the GUTS consortium are Georgetown University, Howard University, MedStar Health Research Institute, the Oak Ridge National Laboratories, and Washington Veterans Affairs Medical Center. So through multiple partnerships and collaborations among these institutions, the GUTS is transforming clinical research and translational science to bring new advances to healthcare. Some of the founding principles behind GUTS include a goal to improve the infrastructure and support high quality multidisciplinary clinical and translational research. We continue to develop GUTS as a model of interdisciplinary and interinstitutional collaboration. We like to leverage our location and expertise and do research around that will have high impact on underserved populations, including minorities, people with disabilities, and the elderly populations. We also design and disseminate vibrant and innovative educational programs. And this is being sponsored by the REKS component, which is regulatory, ethics, knowledge, and support. Our component emphasizes promoting and preserving the integrity of research, the researcher, and the research enterprise, and preserving the trust between the public and the research enterprise, and the public trust in the fruits of the research process. And today, I'm so pleased to welcome Dr. Petros Okubagzi, who serves as the Assistant Vice President, Research Operations at MedStar Health Research Institute. And in this role, he provides leadership and guidance for the research operations at MedStar Health. We will be doing some Q&A in this session, so please enter in the chat. We will also be providing a link to an evaluation if you will do so at the end. Dr. Petros has more than 15 years of experience in managing large research undertakings, and prior to this role, he served as the Executive Director of Cardiovascular Research, and before that was the Director of Cardiovascular Research Programs for MedStar Cardiovascular Research Network. Dr. Okubagzi was awarded his medical degree from Gondar College of Medical Sciences in Gondar, Ethiopia, and he completed a certificate in internal medicine at Addis Ababa University in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, followed by training in research at Nottingham City Hospital, Nottingham of the UK. So Dr. Okubagzi, I understand you're going to be sharing your slides with us today?
That's correct. And can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you so much. And I will turn the floor over to you.
Okay, it says I cannot share until you stop sharing, I think.
Okay.
Okay, do you want to stop sharing? There you go. So let's see. All right, can everybody see my screen?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Perfect. All right, Sarah, thank you for the kind introductions. I'm part of the MedStar Health Research Institute, and I'm very excited to be part of this talk. Obviously, we're dealing with a new time, a new environment, and a new era in clinical research for a number of reasons. And one of those areas is the area of in-home clinical trials and what needs to be done and how that has come about. So what is an in-home clinical trial? You will see that, like everything new, when something starts up, everybody calls it their own name, their own version of things. So you will see a lot of terms here that are interchangeably used, and I would like to put some clarity to it so that we all know what we're talking about here. So the term home-based clinical trial emphasizes the convenience of performing some trial functions at home, such as collecting of blood specimens and administration of treatments by mobile research nurses or coordinators. This is in also in comparison to other terms that are used in decentralized clinical trials, which I'll quickly touch upon. So you'll hear decentralized clinical trials, hybrid or disseminated clinical trials. And what all that stands for are the concept of walking away from brick and mortar ways of clinical trials to more decentralized, home-based or alternative location-based, and using either completely home-based or a hybrid form of a clinical trial that is disseminated within the community and is probably presumably easier to access. Those may not be based in clinical sites. They could be based on clinical sites, but then having part of their activities used at a remote location, or they could be totally home-based. But decentralized, hybrid, and disseminated clinical trials are some terms that are broadly given to clinical trials that we are embarking on at this time. There are other terms that people have been using, direct to participant. Here, there's a little bit of an element where the traditional clinical sites are bypassed, and you'll see that the direct to participant trials are trials where either Facebook or other social media is used, and studies are directly advertised to patients. So there's that aspect to it that we look at when we see direct to clinical trials. And there are virtual clinical trials where literally everything is done online, assessments are done online, and digital technologies are being used to introduce patients into clinical trials, follow them on clinical trials, and also complete the clinical trials. Not so long ago, some of you may be aware that Apple did a study looking at atrial fibrillation. Literally everything was virtual. Patients with Apple Watch were encouraged to join into a clinical trial. They put in their information on the app, and the app tracked their heart rhythm. And based on that data, depending on what happened, they're either referred to a doctor or they are not. And the majority of that clinical trial was completed virtually without a direct contact with patients. So when I'm talking about today on in-home clinical trials, I'm touching a couple of aspects of clinical trials. When I say in-home clinical trials, I'm looking at extenders of traditional clinical trials. The COVID pandemic had created a problem on clinical trial execution because patients were either not allowed to come back into clinical settings, or patients were afraid to come back into clinical settings. So what has happened there is a lot of protocols have allowed us to modify the visits so that either we did it through telehealth, or we had nurses visit patients at home to collect information, data, blood work, and other activities. So that is one aspect of what we call an in-home clinical trial. It's basically a modification currently, but in the future, hopefully an extender of traditional clinical trials. We are part of some clinical trials where we have access to groups that can do patient follow-ups at home. And we have been using those possibilities on patients who cannot return back to the hospital. So, if you have patients who are in a clinical trial and you're going to miss the visit, you could as well have somebody go over there and do the follow-up visits. There could be components of clinical trials. Those are also in-home clinical trials. I have here with me a FedEx box of a specimen that I'm sending back. I myself are part of a clinical trial. And what has happened is I've been sent basically a fingerprint prick kit that I stick myself and then put it on a card, and the card is shipped back to a central lab. So that is part of clinical trials. I am not seeing anybody, I'm not following up with anybody, but some of that part is being done by non-traditional way of sending the blood draw directly to the patient and the patient being part of that study. So that could be another way where you do an in-home clinical trial. Or there are trials where actually the whole clinical trial is being done with you just being at home. I've mentioned the Apple trial, but there are even more complicated studies that are being done at home where patients are actually approached, consented while at home. They're also being sent medications at home with a lot of regulations around that. But those are also other versions of clinical trials where patients will be directly participating in clinical trials without a third party, either a clinical trial site or a CRO involved. So why? Why do we even need to embark into this? And there are very good reasons why we should look at home-based research, regardless of the sites of a particular clinical location. And this is an illustration that I found online, which basically has 100 patients or 100 potential participants in a clinical study. So if you look at this funnel, you'll see that if you had 100 patients you considered for a clinical study, about 31 of those pre-screen and qualify. So about 7 out of 10, you're put a lot of work trying to get them into studies, but they actually do not end up being participants of a study. Then what happens? Then out of those 31, you'll see that you probably get to consent about 13 of them. Again, participation in clinical trials is voluntary. People who come into studies end up not liking the study, or they may meet some of the final, they may not meet some of the final inclusion criteria and they get excluded. So now you're down to 13 patients. And out of the 13 patients, depending on central lab draw, this, that, you end up actually randomizing 9. For most of the meaningful work that is being done, that 9 randomized patients is key because those are the patients that actually the statistical modeling of the clinical trial has been built on. Those are the patients that you think at the end of the day will complete the trial, and based on their completion, you'd have meaningful data for you to submit to the FDA and have your drug, device, whatever you're studying, get approved if that was the goal of the study. Unfortunately, you will see that out of the 9 patients who were randomized, only about 7 complete the study. So if you look at this very closely, it's a problem because that is the group of people where you had powered your statistical powering on, and the fact that they don't complete the study would be a problem when you analyze the data and also getting it accepted in either publications or with the FDA. So when they dropped out, Advar and Forte did a study and looked at why did you drop out? What was the reason that you dropped out after you got randomized? Those were the reasons they gave. Inconvenient location. That means, as we all know, driving from Virginia or Maryland into DC is no fun if your site is in DC. Scheduling conflicts, patients set up schedules, but then they have other pressing personal appointments, this, that, and that was another reason why patients could not complete their follow-up visits. Personal or family matters. Those of us who have done clinical trials for a very long time quickly realize that it's not a study that just a patient participates in, but the whole family participates in, because patients are not be able to come back if there's no family member to drive them. Physically enable, that means, patient participates in the study. Unfortunately, since they enter into the study, a lot of physical things happen to patients, and patients physically cannot return. Financial constraints, a lot of studies are building this into their budgets where patients are given a stipend for the time that they come in, but it is not a negligible reason why patient would stop participating in clinical trials, because if you have to cut something, this would be one of the things that you'd cut off when financial constraints come in. Other less common reasons, just to cite them, was the lack of appreciation, patients forgetting that they have set up visits, fear and anxiety of what they would find if they came back to the hospital, dissatisfaction. Patients don't think that either they got the medication or the medication that they got is not resulting in their improvement, and there was an element of hoping that that medication would have made a difference. Side effects, some patients have side effects, so they stop the medication and they also stop their follow-ups, or basically refusing to comply, or their expectation was completely different when they signed in than what they found. Now, for those where I have used the arrows, the inconvenient location, scheduling conflicts, personal and family matters, physically unable to return, and financial constraints, home-based studies make sense. And that would probably help us limit the number of patients who drop off once they have been randomized into clinical trials. So they followed up those people and they said, okay, you dropped off, and did you have any other reason, or was there one reason that stood out among the many that were cited? So the red circle are the people who dropped off early, and the green circle are the people who completed the study. So the people who dropped off at 38% gave an answer of yes, in the fact that they found the site visit to be stressful. So coming in, waiting, being seen, going home, that all was found to be stressful in 38% of patients versus 16% of patients that actually completed the study. What does that tell us? It tells us that there is a significant chunk, 18% of people that we probably could save if we had home-based clinical trials, or an element of your studies home-based. So how does this work? So the way it has been working for us is that we have a sponsor who generally would approach us on a study, and they would offer that if we needed it, they would be amenable to hiring an organization, a group that would actually complete some of the patient follow-ups at home. It is not unusual now for us to actually be told, rather than given an option, on some studies that at the very get-go actually have an element of a visiting nurse or organization that's going to take some part of that follow-up. That visiting nurse or organization would schedule an appointment with the patient. They would identify the patient through either contact through us or the sponsor. They would make sure that they have the proper staffing for the visit. They will take responsibility for some of the elements of what the protocol requires, and they would have that visit completed. That visit will then either be entered directly into the EDC by that organization, or they would send it back to the study site, where the study site would actually be tasked with entering that information. That requires a lot of coordination, a lot of interaction, especially if the study site is involved, because the patient needs to know to expect those people. And then once the visit has happened, the coordinators would have to check that the visit actually happened, that they would get the data from the visiting nurses and organization, and then also talk to the patient if there's anything else that was missing. The visiting nurse or organization would also be responsible for shipping blood samples, EKGs, echo images, if they have a portable echo, and those images would be sent back to either the site or to a central lab, depending on the organization. Patients may be also part of that design, may be directly sending specimen, like the bag I just showed you, where you actually are directly participant in some part of that visit. And that is generally how it has been working. There's one arrow here that I did not put because it would get in the way, but that is the direct sponsor to patient. So if you look at some of the clinical trials, what has happened is the sponsor has directly sent medications or devices directly to the patient's home, and the data has been collected directly with the patient. That would be what I previously defined as direct patient studies, and that is probably a topic I'll not dwell on today. So what are considerations that we have to look at when we design those studies or when we're part of those studies? From the patient perspective, right? So we have advantages on doing this. If I don't have to drive into DC, park my car, pay for parking, navigate to the building, and somebody's going to come to my house, it's a lot easier. It would make me happier. So presumably, I'll be more compliant in a clinical trial. Very good. I think that is an important part of being part of a clinical trial. The other part is access to clinical trials. So if you were to look at patients who are not physically very close to any of the major places where clinical trials are being conducted, and most of those studies have either a virtual component or predominantly virtual component, now you have a bigger catchment of people who could participate in your clinical trials that you normally would not have to. E-consents have played a role there. We're in MedStar Health, we have a study that's enrolling patients from out of state, and those patients are patients who normally we would not have consented or looked at because of the complexity of clinical trials, but thanks to the newer environment, we have been able to consider patients and participate in clinical trials. What's the disadvantage of having your patients participate in clinical trials? One is a patient perspective. As you all know, patients' comfort with the physician, patients' comfort with the coordinator are very important relationships. It's not unusual for patients who are during clinical trials to end up having other clinical care with the group because they happen to vocalize or they have other problems during their visits. It's not unusual for patients to report things more to the people they trust because they don't expect to be judged by those people, and also because they don't think that that person would take their issue as trivial. So there's a lot of that relationship that could potentially get lost when one is looking at just having a relationship with the patients that just happen to have a visitor today that they probably would not be as comfortable to. The other part to this is technology. Thanks to COVID, there's a lot of newly introduced devices that patients are gradually getting comfortable with. You know, we have patients taking home blood pressure machines, weight scales. We have now patients reporting out that data. So there's a lot of newly introduced devices that patients have to deal with. We have patients who now have to call. Do they get hold of the coordinator? Are they given a run around in the hospital trying to locate the person that they wanted to talk to versus a formal visit where they know they're guaranteed to talk to the person? Televisits, there's a very high adoption today, but we all know that televisits have their own challenges in terms of patients being able to access it and also being available in the right times. What about equity? Let me talk about privacy a little bit more first. So you're introducing a newer element into the equation in terms of privacy here because you have now new staff members who are joining into the group of people who have that original relationship. Obviously, every time something like that happens, you have to worry about an expansion of the group that has access to the patient's data, and the more people you have access to, by even when everybody means well, by sheer number, you have more errors, and also compliance issues that come with it that we are introducing by having those visits and people visit patients. Data transportation. It's not unusual for us to have heard of reports of people who had laptops stolen from their car. Things happen. But now you have even another more group of people who actually have patient data in their cars and they're moving from one patient to the other. And you wonder, how that data transportation happens. It has to happen, but that is a new element that is being added into. The final point or concern here is equity. So you all know about access to clinical trials. People from disadvantaged communities right now have challenges with joining clinical trials. So you wonder what happens when decentralized clinical trials or in-home clinical trials happen. We all know, at least that currently data suggests that about 80% of people have internet access in the US, and about 77, this is a study done in 2017, so I would imagine that that data is even higher today, that 77% of people have some sort of a smartphone. Now, when we are introducing clinical trials where there's an element of using technology and the internet, we all know that we are excluding or there's going to be a group of people who are challenged to join those clinical trials. But do we know who they are? Do we know if they are from the disadvantaged communities? Are we now creating another class of people who don't have access to clinical trials just because they don't happen to be able to have those visits at home or have access to those visits at home? That's another consideration that we have to think about as we go about designing those clinical trials. What about from a site perspective? So obviously it's easier. Physically, it's easier because you don't have to worry about clinic space. You don't have to worry about the logistics, traffic. The patient may come or may not come because you have handed over that responsibility to somebody else. Some studies show that their compliance, and I'll touch upon that when I talk about the MedStar experience. We have better compliance. There's this study that was conducted and completed very recently and published where they had 80 to 100% compliance in a clinical trial. Not bad. I think that is an advantage, and you'd be very happy to have those numbers. But there are disadvantages and also logistical issues that I have run into myself, and I'm sure some of you on this call have heard of or have run into yourselves. And one is direct contracts with sponsors. So now, if you had $100 and you're negotiating $70 for visits for a study, the sponsor now would have to split another $20 or $30 out of that revenue into the group that's doing the site visits. You already have a static infrastructure, your building is paid for, you have staffing that you pay salary to. So relative to other testing that is done, you have a permanent cost of maintaining that infrastructure. So the more and more you have less revenue coming from that, the less and less you'll be able to conduct your studies as you have been doing in the past. So that is an important part that we have been dealing with, is making sure that our contracts actually reflect the level of work, because even if you're going with a CRO or another organization doing this, you still have people in your team that are responsible for organizing that and making sure that those visits happened anyway. So there's a lot of work that's being done on your end, and the static cost that would not change whether this particular visit happened or not, but is also impacting your bottom line. The other part is interest by the PIs on a clinical trial. As you very well know, whenever a clinical trial starts, you have a physician who is a little reluctant or is not exactly sure that the gadget you're studying, the drug you're studying is going to be of any impact. And assuming a study is not randomized, when patients come back and report that they have been doing very well since they started the study, PIs get motivated, and now they would like to actually get more patients into the study. That is the sort of a relationship, and we all know that once you have PIs interested in that, they would be pushing for more people to participate or avail more patients to be approached for clinical trials. If, in the theoretical sense, a PI enrolls a patient into a study, and this has not happened yet, but you would see that the trend is going that way, is if a PI never sees the patient back again, would he be interested in enrolling into that particular study anymore? The second part is, where does the research care stop and where does the clinical care start? Because if you had a procedure, you'd be back to see your doctor in 30 days. You'd go back to see your doctor in a year. Now, you have those research visits, which generally would try to coincide with the clinical care. But here you have a patient who's getting approached, is being seen at home, say in week 5, a week after they saw their doctor. And now who coordinates if the patient is complaining of new things? Do you send it back to the site? How does that get organized? Those are all things that I think from a site perspective will be headaches that we deal with in the future as those clinical trials start to expand. But those are things that I think would be disadvantages or new things that we would have to deal with as we go about doing those studies. There are also combined industry and site concerns that I have, and I'll start with the financial reputational start, and that is every time there's a new technology, every time there's a new way of doing things, somebody is going to have to go first. Somebody is going to have to breach that concept and get studies rolling. As you know, pharmaceutical and device industries, when it comes to research, are very conservative. So there's always a you go first approach to them looking at this. And not so long ago, there was a study looking at overactive bladder treatment using a medication that was totally remote. This was all done over line. Patients participated, they were shipped the medication, but the enrollment rate into the study was very low. So they had to stop the study. Significant amount of money was lost, but more importantly, the information that that study did not do well actually sends shockwaves through the industry, looking at possibly using this as a way to do clinical trials. So you would have to take the risk on some. The other thing is, what sort of a data is being collected? So if a patient reports certain symptoms at home and you're trying to do a walk test, they don't have a 15 foot, 30 feet, whatever your study requires, and you modified it to a shorter version, is your data is equivalent to the one where you used it in a hospital hallway and everybody walked the same distance? Does somebody's home have a tilt to it that you did not account for? Some of the questionnaires are provided online. Are those being perceived the same way as the physical questionnaires were? Did the participant had an opportunity to ask the coordinator the question while at home completing it, he did not have access to? Then the other issue there is, okay, say everything is the same and you have now participants. So you will reliably say that, say, if you're doing a study in DC, it would probably be predominantly African-American, it would have males more than females or what have you. When you open up those clinical trials and you have now a broader reach, does your demographic group represent the true population of the United States? Are you missing things there because the people who tend to use this are a specific subset of our population? And is there a way for us to make sure before the study starts that there are guardrails in there so that you don't end up completing a study and realize that all your data was collected on a very separate demographic group that normally would not have participated in those clinical trials? And when the FDA looks at this data, they would be looking at your data and comparing it to historical data and they may be in a situation where they'll be in a tight space because you really are not reflective of the population that has been doing the study. And then our tools standardized today, and they're easy to use. One of the problems they had with the remote study was that there are a lot of steps that were involved in being part of the study, and some of the patients just dropped off because they really could not figure out how to do it, or when they figured it out how to do it, they were not doing it in a standardized way. So that all also ties into that issue that both sides and the industry would be concerned about as you're doing those studies. We have regulatory and legal issues. Overall, I would like to tell you that the FDA is very supportive. The FDA has been part of a lot of panels, have been part of a lot of working groups trying to make sure that we are doing decentralized clinical trials and that there's a more broader access to clinical trials and supporting more recruitment into clinical trials. But there are rules and regulations that we have to do today that have not changed, that are things that we have to consider. Say you have a study and now part of that follow-up is farmed out to an organization who's contracted out directly to the sponsor. Who's responsible for training the people going to the house on the most recent version of the protocol? Normally, the PI would be responsible for making sure that their staff are trained on this protocol. But who does it here? Who is responsible? How is that organized? Who documents that? And how does the FDA look at it when they come in to do their audits? That's a question that needs to be worked out as time passes. There's an adverse event. So I go to a person's house, I'm part of a company doing this follow-up, and the patient complains that he has nasal bleeding. Is it minor? Is it major? The site, normally a site PI would have a final say. He would ask the questions, he would have follow-up questions, and based on that, adjudicate that this would be a serious adverse event or not so serious adverse event. How do you deal with it when you're getting it on a piece of paper, or this has been directly entered into an ADC? Who's responsible for that? God forbid somebody gets injured during those follow-up visits. What are the legal protections the people going to the house have? What happens if the staff member visiting the patient gets bitten by their dog? Who's responsible for that? There are things that we normally now are not thinking about. And please don't take this as anything negative, because we're part of in-home studies. This is the future. We will have to figure out what to do, but those are real issues that we have to start thinking about it. So the other issues are, how are changes in the protocol communicated with the contract staff? Do they get it directly from the sponsor? Are we responsible as sites into giving them? And if they are, then how do we ensure that the next person who's coming down is responsible? Drug custody issues. So during the pandemic, the one thing that the FDA had allowed was for drugs to be directly shipped to the patient. MedStar Health had to go through a process of figuring out how to make sure that the drug follows the chain custody. We had to come up with policies and procedures to make sure that this is compliant with the current FDA rules. But those are things that every organization is going to need to put in place before they ship drugs directly to the patient, because there's stability issues, there's custody issues that need to be addressed and be compliant with FDA. Then there are data integrity and privacy responsibilities. Somebody loses their laptop and happens to be working for the company who's doing the follow-up. Whose privacy is going to be responsible for that? Would it be the entities? Would it be the companies? Those are things that we need to think about as we go about doing things. But those are all things that we need to work through. I am sure same problems happened when big clinical trials came in, but those are things that in my head, would be things that we all should be thinking about as we make things happen. What does the FDA think? Well, the pandemic helped. The pandemic helped in the sense that the FDA actually has now guidance about how to conduct clinical trials. I have picked one paragraph from, and the link is there. It's the conduct of clinical trials of medical products during COVID pandemic. It's a guidance for industry, investigators, and IRBs. And what they say is, since trial participants may not be able to come to the investigational site for protocol-specific visits, sponsors should evaluate whether alternative methods for safety assessments, phone calls, virtual visits, alternative location for assessments, including local labs or imaging centers, could be implemented when necessary and feasible, and would be sufficient to assure the safety of trial participants. The FDA is interested in making those happen and trying to get as much data as possible, even during the pandemic, to make sure that the patient safety is protected as much as is physically possible, while being cognizant that it may not be in the patient's best interest for patients to come back to the physical locations. This is another note from Leonard Sachs, who's the Associate Director of Clinical Methodology, who was also part of a panel looking from the science and education point of view. And his note was, however, for medical technologists to reach their potential of bringing a clinical trial to the participant, policies and regulations to address patient safety, privacy, data integrity, and the responsibility of investigators in a decentralized clinical trial environment needs to be in place. A very important thing, because once the FDA has detailed guidance, I think everybody will know what the guardrails are here, and as they go about studies, they actually would be able to conduct them very well, knowing that there's a black and white for everything that they are doing. Right now, we have more of a guidance, we have more of permission to do things, but once the pandemic is over and the emergency situation is reversed, then most of those guidances will go away and they need to be replaced by more permanent rules and regulations. So saying all that, where are we? So in MedStar Health, we have one of the parts of MedStar Health is the MedStar Home Health Service, which used to be called the Visiting Nurses Association. We had the infrastructure of people going to patients' houses, doing clinical follow-up visits and completing blood work, doing physical therapy, checking on wounds and what have you. And that was a very good starting point for us to try and engage the home health services and help us out with clinical trials where patients were not able to return. I'm not going to tell you that all our clinical trials have that aspect to it. We are very early in this road, but we have made some progress. And I have picked one study that has shown results, and that is the HIV intervention program. We're part of a program looking at patients with HIV who actually are not compliant. And what we have done is we have asked the MedStar Home Health Services to help us out and go look at patients and visit them and ensure that they are compliant. With that, what we are able to do is that you'll see that there was a 90% improvement in 3 months when followed at home on the viral load. A 90% improvement. That is a very significant improvement. And this was mainly because they dealt with the same person, even though we assume that the clinical care setting has a more permanent relationship. You can imagine that not the same doctor may be in the clinic when a patient returns. So having that permanent person coming back and following with them was one of the reasons why patients felt that they were better, and also they had a higher satisfaction when they were surveyed. We're also looking at studies where we have been asking the visiting nurses to actually draw blood on clinical trials that required follow-up blood draws, and they did not need to come in. And as I had mentioned earlier, we also had studies that needed drugs shipped directly to patients where we have been participants. Those are not big studies, they are more of orphan studies, but it's doable. We have the procedures and policies in place now to be able to do that. Finally, in summary, this is what I would have to say about in-home clinical trials, is that in-home clinical trials are here to stay, whether we like it or not. The question is how quickly is the adoption and how widely the adoption is going to be. And we will have to have the proper logistical and regulatory support so that we will be able to expand our ability to conduct clinical trials with research participants. There are concerns about confidentiality, security, training, which are real and need to be considered when one is designing clinical trials. And while there's a goodwill from regulatory agencies, there will need to be more clearer regulations so that people are not assuming, but know for a fact what the rules and the guardrails are, so that we'll be able to have clinical trials that we know at the end of the day would have valid data that the FDA would be able to look at and say, yep, this is acceptable, and would approve it. There's a lot of goodwill. Like I said, FDA has been working with a lot of groups and trying making this a reality. There are a number of clinical trials that have been completed, and I think this is the future, and would have to figure out how to make it happen on our locations. Thank you very much. I will be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Okubagzi. I'd also be interested in entertaining questions, but I have a question just to get us started. We have a few more minutes that we can spend together. I'm interested in whether or not you think that there will be cost differences, or will it come out to balance the same, whether we're in home or on site?
So it's one of those things where conceptually it should be cheaper to do it in whole, conceptually. But the devil is in the details. And what I think is going to happen is, I would think that people, and this is my guess, is that people will probably going to be doing in-house clinical trials more for efficiency, recruitment, and the ease of completion, which has a financial impact, but may not be a per patient interaction. So the way I would see it is, if you have a study that's going to take you 3 years to enroll, and you're paying a CRO every month, you're running a clinical trial, you have clinical trial staff, but you're able to complete it in 1 year, 2 years, you're saving money. So from an industry perspective, there will be that room. But from a site perspective, I think if anything, we will be financially challenged, because we will end up having to accommodate some of those expenses. I mean, even with the MedStar, when we use the MedStar home health services, there are payments we have to make for the home health services that we normally would not.
So let me just follow that up then about the home health services, because it seems like what you were saying is, when you went to stand that service up, that they were embracing the research enterprise. And so I'm assuming they did the standard trainings, and they had their city trainings even themselves, and they were doing like as a research entity. But I would imagine that's not the same across the country. So you could collaborate, right, with a home service, but that might not be the same as one that is set up specifically with a research mission.
Correct. But that's where I think the change in the regulations need to help us.
Okay.
If you really think about it, a phlebotomist whose task was drawing blood and does it on 100 patients a day would not need to have any special training or any knowledge of the protocol when they're drawing blood, right? You have a lab in the hospital that you draw blood on, that you use in clinical trials today. So maybe the bar of who needs training, how much training, may have to change a little bit, so that you may train the PI, the sub-PI, and then probably essential people, and not everybody. But that is one avenue where I think the regulations are going to help, because I think even if there's a goodwill, even if there's a commitment, I think when you involve 100 parties, you are risking errors, you are risking non-compliance. So the way I would see this is that down the line, we would have a limit to what a training group or a training organization would need to do to be part of this business. Because even from their perspective, if I am sending them 4 patients in a study, 5 patients in a study, would you be interested in having a 2-hour training of your staff? Probably not, right?
I was thinking about like a person that comes into the home to do a visit. Normally on the CRUs, right, or the clinical research units, we use what's called sort of a reviewing the consent. Today's visit is going to be this lab work. We're going to do this infusion, or this kind of thing. And so when you have someone who's not as familiar, and the participant might say, well, I don't feel like having my labs drawn today. How they respond to things like that, who do they call, what do they do, just kind of interesting kind of things that it definitely seems like there's a lot of organization that has to happen.
Absolutely. And that is where I think that the site budgets, I would push very hard in making sure that my site budget is not that significantly different, even when they argue that, because even if you think about it, even if I have a visiting group, I still have a coordinator calling the patient, telling them that this is going to happen. Remember, you're part of the study. For your 3-month visit, there's maybe a visiting nurse coming your way. Do you have any questions? So that part is still going to be there. That relationship is still going to be there. So that's where I don't think on a site level, the costs are going to be that different. I think it's mainly going to be that you get to finish the studies and more compliantly in a shorter time. That's probably what's going to come.
Well, I really appreciate all this great information. We do have, we're almost out of time, and we do have our evaluation is popped up in the chat if everyone would have an opportunity to do that. Thank you so much for joining today. And next week, or sorry, 2 weeks, on the 14th, we'll be doing e-consent. So I hope everyone will join us then. Thank you again, Dr. Okubagzi, for joining us today. And I will sign off.
Thank you. Thank you for attending.